The air was thick and unmoving. Ashtrays overflowed, cigarette smoke clung to the walls, and half-drunk teacups sat untouched on the floor. Guitar strings cut into fingertips already raw. Eyes burned from lack of sleep. Shirts stuck to skin under buzzing lights that never fully shut off. The room felt too small for 4 people, yet somehow held everything they were becoming. And this is the part most people miss. The greatest songs in history weren't born in inspiration, but in confinement. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Beatles didn't stumble into legendary songwriting. They built it under pressure, repetition, and routine so intense it bordered on obsession. In their early years, songwriting wasn't a sacred act. It was survival. Hamburg clubs demanded hours of non-stop performance, night after night. Mistakes weren't forgiven. Weak songs didn't survive. If a melody failed to hold a room full of shouting strangers, it was discarded immediately. That environment, trained their instincts brutally fast. What sounds almost mythic today has a grounded explanation. The magic people describe in their early songs wasn't paranormal talent. It was accelerated feedback. Play a song for 8 hours straight, and flaws exposed themselves fast. Choruses tightened, lyrics sharpened, hooks became unavoidable. And that loop never stopped. But something darker crept in as the rooms changed. Hotel rooms replaced clubs. Studios replaced stages. The walls closed in again, just quieter this time. Songwriting became more internal, competitive, psychological. Lennon and McCartney didn't just write together. They watched each other, corrected each other, silently tried to outdo one another. That tension sharpened their work in ways no solo artist could replicate. Some fans claim there was something otherworldly about how fast the songs came. Entire classics written in hours, melodies appearing fully formed. The grounded explanation is less mystical, but no less unsettling. Constant immersion rewires the brain. When creativity becomes routine instead of inspiration, output explodes. Whether that feels supernatural depends on how you look at it. And that raises the question that splits fans in half. Were the Beatles' geniuses touched by something beyond explanation, or were they the result of a system so intense it couldn't end any other way? It didn't sound like conflict at first. It sounded like laughter, half-finished lyrics, guitars overlapping in small rooms. But beneath that easy rhythm was something sharper. Every idea was being measured, every melody quietly ranked, and neither of them ever said it out loud, but both knew they were keeping score. The songwriting engine at the heart of the Beatles wasn't harmony. It was tension. John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote together, but they didn't write the same way. Lennon chased rawness. He liked lines that felt exposed, even uncomfortable. McCartney chased structure. He polished, refined, and reshaped until a song felt inevitable. When those instincts collided, something strange happened. Weaknesses disappeared. Lennon's chaos gained form. McCartney's perfection gained bite. What people often call chemistry was really pressure. Neither wanted to bring a weak idea into the room. If a lyric landed flat, it didn't get sympathy. It got rewritten. If a melody felt predictable, it was quietly dismantled. That environment forced speed and decisiveness. Songs didn't linger. They either evolved fast or died fast. There's a rumor that Lennon sometimes deliberately brought unfinished or flawed ideas just to see if McCartney could fix them. Some fans read that as manipulation, others as playful trust. The grounded explanation is simpler. Collaboration under constant deadlines rewards provocation. Throw something broken into the room and the system forces a solution. But the balance was fragile. As their success exploded, so did the stakes. Credit mattered more. Ownership became personal. Songs started arriving more complete, less open to change. What once felt like a shared brain began to split into territories. Here's where the myth creeps in. Some claim the rivalry unlocked a kind of dual consciousness, like two opposing forces creating something neither could access alone. The grounded reality is psychological amplification. When two elite creators mirror and challenge each other daily, their output accelerates beyond normal limits. It feels supernatural because most artists never experience that level of sustained opposition. And the numbers quietly back this up. During their peak years, Lennon and McCartney were releasing material at a pace solo artists rarely maintain even once in a lifetime. Not because they were relaxed, but because they were constantly being watched by the one person whose opinion mattered most. That tension didn't just shape songs, it shaped identity. Each new track wasn't just music, it was a statement, a response, sometimes a rebuttal. But pressure like that doesn't stay productive forever. And the very force that sharpened their writing was already bending it towards something unstable. Because once rivalry replaces play, the question changes. Was this tension the secret ingredient that made their songs immortal? Or the fuse that guaranteed everything would eventually fall apart? By the time most artists are still chasing their first hit, the Beatles were already moving too fast to stop. Days blurred together, nights disappeared entirely. Songs weren't written when inspiration struck. They were written because the schedule demanded it. Their early workload was punishing. In Hamburg alone, they played marathon sets that stretched 4, sometimes 6 hours a night. Little rest, loud rooms, constant repetition. That pace didn't just sharpen their playing, it rewired how they created. Melodies became instinct, lyrics turned automatic. When exhaustion strips away overthinking, whatever remains tends to be honest. Some fans later claimed this period unlocked a heightened creative state, like sleep deprivation cracked open something hidden. The grounded explanation is less mystical, but just as intense. Studies on cognitive overload show that when the brain is forced to perform under fatigue, it leans on pattern recognition and emotional memory. Translation: you stop trying to be clever and start being effective, and effective songs survive. Here's where the numbers start to feel unreal, and this is your first scale paragraph. Between 1962 and 1966, they released 7 studio albums. They placed 20 songs at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, a record still untouched. Some albums were recorded in under 100 hours of total studio time. At their peak, they were writing and recording multiple charting songs per month. During early tours, they performed over 250 live shows per year. That output wasn't sustainable. And that's the point. There's a popular rumor that substances played a major role in sustaining that pace. Some listeners swear they can hear it in the music. The grounded reality is more boring and more dangerous. Routine plus expectation. When the machine keeps moving, you move with it, or you get crushed. But cracks started to show. Songs became more inward. Lyrics turned fragmented. Time. Signatures loosened. Some interpret this shift as experimentation guided by altered perception. Others point to burnout finally surfacing in the work itself. Both readings are possible, and neither fully explains how the quality stayed so high while the pressure mounted. What's undeniable is this: speed became part of the songwriting formula. Slow reflection wasn't an option. Decisions were made instantly. Hooks were trusted or discarded without debate. That urgency gave their songs a momentum that still feels alive decades later. But speed has a cost. And once the schedule stops being external and starts living inside your head, rest becomes impossible. Which leads to the uncomfortable question that follows them everywhere. Did their relentless pace unlock the greatest songwriting run in history? Or did it quietly set the timer on everything that came next? There's a moment when a song stops sounding written and starts sounding received. That's the feeling many listeners describe when certain Beatles tracks first hit their ears. melodies that feel too complete, lyrics that seem to arrive already knowing the listener, songs that don't unfold, they appear. This is where the mythology around the Beatles takes a strange turn. Fans have spent decades pointing to specific songs and asking the same question: how did they know to do that? Chord changes that shouldn't resolve, but do. Lyrics that feel prophetic in hindsight. Studio choices that predate trends by years. Some listeners go further, claiming the band tapped into something beyond themselves. A shared unconscious, a collective signal, even messages picked up rather than composed. Take the way certain melodies feel inevitable, as if they've always existed. That sensation fuels the paranormal reading that these songs weren't created, only uncovered. That Lennon or McCartney were acting less like writers and more like antennas. The grounded explanation sits closer to psychology and music theory. When creators internalize structure deeply enough, they begin to predict emotional outcomes before consciously thinking them through. Familiar chord progressions are bent just enough to surprise without alienating. Lyrical phrasing mirrors natural speech rhythms, making lines feel instantly personal. It feels supernatural because the craft disappears. But even that explanation doesn't cover everything. There are demos where songs emerge nearly complete. First takes that sound final. Lyrics written in minutes that still hold decades later. Skeptics argue this is selective memory. We only remember the miracles, not the dozens of discarded attempts. That's true, but it doesn't erase how often the miracles happened. Some claim certain songs reflect shared dreams or mirrored thoughts between band members. The grounded version is less mystical, but still unsettling. Extreme proximity. Years of writing side by side creates overlapping mental habits. You start finishing each other's musical sentences because you've learned the patterns too well. Still, the eerie feeling lingers, especially when later artists describe trying to replicate that process and failing completely. They can copy the chords, the instruments, the studio techniques, but not the effect. And maybe that's why the paranormal interpretation refuses to die. When something can be analyzed but not reproduced, mystery rushes in to fill the gap. Whether these songs came from genius intuition or something that felt larger than the people making them, the result was the same. Music that doesn't age normally. It just waits. Which leaves the divide wide open. Were these songs the product of perfect craft pushed to its limit? Or moments where something slipped through that can't be fully explained? At a certain point, storytelling stops working. The only way to understand what the Beatles were doing is to look at the scale, because the scale is where things start to feel unreal. From 1962 to 1970, they released 13 studio albums in just 8 years. Not demos, not filler projects. Albums that would each define an entire era for most artists. In the U.S. alone, they scored 20 #1 singles, many of them written and recorded while actively touring. At their peak, they occupied 5 of the top 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100 at the same time, a feat no one has repeated. Some recording sessions ran 12 to 14 hours straight, stacking takes on top of takes until songs were finished out of sheer momentum. That volume doesn't just suggest productivity. It suggests pressure. Here's where people start using words like madness. How could 4 people sustain that output without something breaking? Some fans believe the numbers point to an altered state, that the band entered a euphoric flow so deep it bypassed normal limits. Others argue the opposite, that this was a system grinding forward with no off switch. The grounded explanation lives in infrastructure. They had deadlines enforced by labels, studios booked back-to-back, and a global audience demanding constant novelty. Songs weren't precious, they were necessary. That mindset removes hesitation. When there's no time to protect ideas, only to execute them, output skyrockets. Still, even that doesn't explain the consistency. High volume usually means uneven quality. But their weakest tracks still outperformed most of their peers' best work. That's the part analysts struggle with. Some speculate the studio itself became an extension of their songwriting, almost a fifth member. Tape loops, reverse recordings, artificial double tracking. The paranormal framing says the technology unlocked portals. The grounded reality is more practical. Experimentation multiplies options. When failure is allowed at speed, breakthroughs happen more often. What the numbers really reveal is compression. Their entire creative lifespan was condensed into a few relentless years. Most artists spread that arc over decades. The Beatles burned through it at full intensity. And there's a consequence to that kind of compression. When everything happens at once, growth and collapse sit side by side. Success doesn't arrive gently. It slams in, rearranges everything, and demands more. By the time the numbers peaked, the cost was already being paid behind the scenes. Songwriting stopped being shared. Credits hardened. Rooms grew quieter. The machine that once fed creativity started feeding on it instead, which makes the scale impossible to ignore. Were these numbers proof of the greatest creative run ever recorded, or evidence of a pace no human system could survive for long? The moment touring stopped, the pressure didn't ease. It changed shape. Silence replaced screaming crowds. The studio became sealed, controlled, and relentless. And inside that quiet, the Beatles discovered something dangerous. If songwriting had limits, the studio could erase them. Before this, studios documented performances. You played the song. You captured it. Done. But they flipped the order. Songs were no longer finished before recording. They were discovered during it. Tape became a drafting tool. Mistakes became material. Time itself could be bent. This is where the mythology gets loud. People talk about sounds appearing from nowhere, voices that don't feel anchored to bodies, instruments behaving like ghosts. Some listeners swear certain tracks feel inhuman, like they weren't built with hands at all. The paranormal framing claims the studio opened doors that looping tape and reversing sound let something unfamiliar slip in. The grounded explanation is more precise and just as unsettling. When you remove the need to perform a song start to finish, composition fractures. You can stack moments, isolate seconds, build emotion surgically. Artificial double tracking, for example, didn't summon anything supernatural. It tricked the ear into hearing intimacy multiplied. The effect feels unreal because the brain isn't built to process it naturally. Still, the results changed songwriting forever. Choruses didn't need to repeat. Bridges could disappear. Lyrics could be fragments instead of stories. A song didn't have to explain itself. It just had to feel right. That shift pulled songwriting away from narrative and toward atmosphere. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. Here's the quiet cost. When the studio becomes the weapon, collaboration changes. Decisions move from instinct to control. Whoever commands the room commands the song. That dynamic began to tilt. Some ideas arrived fully formed. Others were constructed piece by piece while band members waited in separate rooms. Fans argue about whether this era represents creative liberation or the beginning of isolation. The paranormal reading says the music gained depth but lost grounding. The grounded view says the process simply outgrew the group dynamic that created it. Both interpretations live uncomfortably close to the truth. What's undeniable is that songwriting stopped being democratic. The studio rewarded obsession. Whoever stayed longest, listened hardest, pushed further, won. And that victory showed up on tape. By the end of this phase, songs weren't just written, they were engineered. Emotion was measured, surprise was calculated. Nothing was accidental anymore, even when it sounded like it was. And that raises the next fracture point. Did turning the studio into a songwriting weapon unlock their boldest ideas? Or did it quietly turn them into strangers sharing the same room? At first, the words were simple: love, longing, distance, feelings that could belong to anyone. But somewhere along the way, the lyrics stopped reaching outward and started folding inward. And once that happened, there was no safe distance left. This was the moment songwriting for the Beatles became uncomfortable, even for them. Lines began to sound less like characters and more like confessions. Resentment slipped into melodies. Sarcasm hid in harmony. Some songs felt like open letters no one was meant to read, yet everyone did. Listeners sensed it immediately. Something had shifted. The songs weren't just catchy anymore. They were personal. Fans loved to argue that certain lyrics were coded messages, insults disguised as poetry, or private jokes only the band could understand. Some even claimed the songs functioned like diary entries set to music. The paranormal-leaning interpretation suggests the music acted as an emotional leak, truth slipping out without permission. The grounded explanation is simpler and more brutal. When artists exhaust external themes, they turn inward, and when collaboration starts fraying, lyrics become territory. Writing becomes a way to say things that can't be spoken out loud in the room. This shift changed how songs were received. Listeners didn't just sing along, they searched. Every line felt intentional, every pause suspicious. The band became aware of this scrutiny, which only sharpened the writing further. Ambiguity wasn't accidental anymore, it was armor, but that armor cut both ways. When lyrics stop being universal and start being specific, unity cracks. Songs that once belonged to the group now felt owned by individuals. Credit mattered more. Interpretation became political. Even silence said something. Some point to this era as proof of lyrical evolution, honesty replacing polish. Others see it as exposure, where songwriting became a battleground instead of a bond. The truth probably sits somewhere in between. What's eerie is how well the music absorbed the tension. Melodies stayed bright while lyrics darkened. Harmonies smoothed over lines that felt sharp underneath. It created a dissonance listeners could feel, even if they couldn't explain it. And once lyrics cross that line, once they become too close, there's no returning to innocence. You can't unknow what's been said, even if it's hidden behind metaphor, which leaves the question hanging heavy. Did their most personal lyrics push songwriting into a new era of honesty? Or did they quietly expose fractures that music could no longer hide? By the time the music started sounding fractured, the process already was. Writing no longer happened in the same rooms. Conversations shortened, decisions hardened. What once felt like a shared mission now felt like parallel paths that rarely crossed. This was the moment the songwriting system that powered the Beatles began turning inward on itself. Songs arrived complete instead of collaborative. Demos were presented, not explored. Suggestions felt like intrusions. The studio, once a playground, became a courtroom. Silence carried more weight than arguments ever did. Fans often frame this period as inevitable tragedy. Too much genius, too much pressure, too fast. Some even describe the later sessions as emotionally haunted, pointing to tracks that feel distant, cold, or unresolved. The paranormal-leaning take claims the music captured an ending before anyone admitted it aloud. The grounded explanation is harder to romanticize. Creative systems break when trust erodes. When contributors stop believing their input matters, they stop offering it. And when songwriting becomes about control instead of exchange, fragmentation follows naturally. Here's where another scale paragraph brings the collapse into focus. In the final years, entire albums were recorded with members working separately for days at a time. Some songs featured only one Beatle playing most instruments. Sessions stretched to hundreds of recorded takes, many never intended for release. Mediators were brought into meetings that once required none. Release schedules slowed dramatically, not from lack of ideas, but from friction. Listeners argue about whether the quality dipped or simply changed shape. Some hear exhaustion, others hear clarity. Both are valid. But the cohesion, the sense of four minds moving as one, was gone. What makes this period unsettling is how calm it sounds. There's no explosive collapse on record, no obvious breakdown, just music that feels slightly disconnected from itself. Beautiful, but distant. Precise, but lonely. And maybe that's the real tell. When creativity stops being shared, it doesn't die loudly. It fades quietly. By the time the end became official, the songwriting machine had already shut itself down, not because the talent disappeared, but because the conditions that made it possible no longer existed, which leads to the final uncomfortable divide. Was the breakup a failure of personalities, or the natural end of a system that burned too hot to last? Long after the rooms emptied and the silence set in, the machine kept running. Not in studios, not on stage, but everywhere else. Because the most unsettling thing about the Beatles isn't what they did. It's how often it keeps happening again. Modern artists swear they're doing something new. Different tools, different genres, different eras. And yet, the patterns line up almost perfectly. Rapid output followed by burnout. Intense collaboration turning competitive. Studios replacing stages. Lyrics drifting from universal to painfully personal. Reinvention accelerating until collapse feels inevitable. No one plans to copy this arc. It just appears. Some fans lean into the eerie interpretation that the Beatles didn't just influence music, they imprinted a template. That once they cracked a certain creative code, anyone who chases greatness eventually stumbles into the same structure. The grounded explanation is less mystical but just as haunting. Their process solved a problem every artist faces: how to balance speed, innovation, and connection. And the solution came with a hidden cost. The numbers reinforce the loop. Most bands who dominate culturally do so for 3 to 5 years before fragmentation sets in. Albums arrive faster. Public expectation spikes. Internal dynamics strain. The same forces that create momentum start eroding trust. The cycle repeats with alarming consistency. What's wild is how rarely the ending is avoided. Songwriting systems inspired by the Beatles prioritize output over preservation, emotion over distance, risk over safety. That's why the highs feel so high, and why the crashes come just as hard. You can slow the process, but then the magic dulls. You can protect the people, but the urgency fades. There's no clean solution. That's the real legacy. Not the chords, not the melodies. But the blueprint. A way of making music that burns bright and fast, leaving behind songs that feel timeless, and a story that feels unfinished. And maybe that's why their catalog still feels alive. It isn't frozen in history. It's actively repeating itself through others. Every artist who hits that impossible balance is unknowingly stepping into the same current. So the story doesn't end with a breakup or a final album. It ends with a choice that every generation faces again and again. Do you chase the process that makes legends, knowing exactly what it costs, or do you walk away before the loop closes around you?